Welcome to Beyond the Raise podcast, where we get under the hood of founder scaling stories. Will and I are here this week with Stanley Wilson, co-founder of SOLR AI. Welcome to the podcast, Stanley.
Pleasure to be here.
Shall I call you Stan? We know each other now. So
yeah,
shall I call you
let's go
Stan?
Stan. We've made it to that level now.
That's what I thought. We'll get informal straight away. Good stuff. Well, look, thanks for taking the time. And I think that the first thing that we always start with is, in a sentence or two, what does SOLR AI actually do?
So I guess that short elevator pitch is always renewable energy intelligence, right? And that is a bit of a buzzwordy answer, but it becomes quite complicated to give a short understanding of what we're doing. But in short, we really are building proprietary computer vision models to help tackle problems within the renewable energy transition.
Okay, fine. So what was it? And, what was that sort of light bulb moment where you thought, there is a problem with that thing, and I think I've got the cool idea to solve that problem? Or is there multiple problems that you're going to solve over time?
There's always a lot of problems, but I would say at its inception, for sure, it was one specific problem. And that was about 4 years ago. One of my close friends was having solar panels installed on their property, and they were going with a full car charger and battery system. And we both worked in engineering together. And he's very well versed in engineering systems and managing engineering processes. And his immediate discovery with how this process was managed from initial interest through to final installation seemed very old school. People like to use the word incumbent, but I think incumbent would be maybe too generous. And so I think there was a lot of manual processes. And so I think this was sort of legacy electrical engineers who had upskilled and got into the world of solar panel installations, battery installations, and their obviously capacity to install is perfect. But the process in which they were getting to that final install date was quite cumbersome, to say the least. And so part of that was telephone screening calls, asking information about the landscape of your property, about what face the front of your property's faces, like trying to get sort of, what side does this roof face? Information that I would say most people probably don't even know about their own property, let alone a property that they're potentially renting or something like that. And so once that process had gone through, they would do a site assessment where they would come, drive in a van, go up on a ladder, take some measurements of the roof face, try and calculate some information about the location of the property and what kind of the local sort of like irradiance maps of like how much light will be hitting this part of each roof face. So basic calculations that they're sort of making, and they sort of draw up these plans and then get back to you maybe in a week or 2 weeks. And it seemed really, really lengthy to get through this just procurement process, let's say. And so at the time, a very close friend of mine was working a very successful insurance tech startup called Tractable. And so they had built these incredible computer vision models where instead of someone claiming a car insurance claim in the US, where an agent would have to assess the car to make sure that the claim correlates with what was being claimed for, they built a tool so that someone could scan this car with their phone, and then their computer vision models would take an assessment and then correlate that with what the claim was claiming for. And they were able to finalize this claim and finalize this sort of initial problem to the insurer without an agent having to be at the site. And so that was kind of the inception many years ago, where I thought, how could you apply similar technology to the solar installation space, where installers are not just having to not go to the site to generate proposals and do assessments, but the human in the loop doesn't have to be the installer, or the insurer or the agent. It's an elevated step in technology if you can provide a tool for that insurance agent to go to the car and use this tool to speed up their process. But it's transformatively disruptive if you can provide a tool that's so good that the car owner themselves is using it, and the human in the loop is just the car owner or the property owner in our case. And so I thought, well, okay, how do I sort of abstract that and sort of pull on that thread and try and think about what processes go into making that assessment. So, what are all the layers and all of the data entry points that those installers would have to find to finalize that proposal? And so I guess, at its inception was automating the solar proposal process. And obviously 4 years on, that has changed quite a lot, because I think the capabilities of AI 4 years ago was quite different to how things are now. It wasn't particularly in the zeitgeist as much as it is something that is maybe every fourth word mentioned in a LinkedIn or in an email chain. But it was a interesting time where you were kind of using fundamental principles. And so in the early stages, it was training foundation computer vision models, and you'd basically just have this stack of training data sets. So you're manually annotating roof faces, and you think, okay, well, what are all the things that an installer needs to just generate this output? And so part of that is, okay, well, when they're up on the roof, they're obviously observing the roof face and measuring that roof. And so for us at that time, we were gathering data from satellite sources. And obviously, I'm getting a bit carried away talking about the product. I can't help falling into the sales talk. But that I would say 4 years ago, to answer the question simply, was automating the solar proposal process.
Yeah. I think because we know that space relatively well, and sort of more the CNI world. We've got clients that sort of are involved in that space. And obviously, with you said a minute ago, AI is mentioned constantly, but now I understand that as you sort of framed it there. I don't think I've ever sort of come across a human job which is better to be completely obliterated by AI, because I know that process very well from our clients that have, the designers and everything else and the electrical engineers on site and looking at it. But we know that process is not quick. It's a bit painful, all the rest of it. So if you can do that via AI, that seems incredibly smart. Now, I don't want to give other people ideas, but are there lots of competition trying to do similar? Because it feels like it's a very good idea. And I appreciate there's probably something in the actual tech that you're using rather than just using something off the shelf, because I doubt that exists. So are there competitors for you at the moment, or?
There was 4 years ago, and now there is quite a lot now.
Right.
I would say, one of our biggest competitors at the time was so large that it would be ridiculous for me to even say they were a competitor. Aurora Solar, based in the States.
Right.
Incredible technology. They entered the market a very long time ago. And they've done amazing work, sort of dominating the commercial and the residential industry. But they are predominantly focused in the US market. And I think the appetite for even big startups can be satisfied very easily just with the US. And so that means that a lot of these US competitors just don't flow into the European markets. And that's one part of the reason why it's left a bit of a gap in the market for us to sort of penetrate the UK and EU. But it's not to say that there aren't UK and EU players. It's just that I feel like it's a competitive landscape, but there are significant differentiating factors about what we're doing. And sometimes these things are complementary, right? We're in the process of a discovery process with an energy company, and they have some legacy tools, but they also have tools that would be considered as competitors in our space. However, we're not necessarily coming in and disrupting their entire workflow and replacing all of their current tools with what we bring to the table. There is some elements where we can sit within one segment and work extremely well in this vertical, with the interest of potentially just expanding through their workflow as they get accustomed to our tools. But it's very much that I certainly feel driven to do what I'm doing because I really do care about the energy transition. I massively, deeply care about, energy debt, the crisis, the climate crisis. So, okay, there is some ruthless competition in startups, but when there's founders that have the same intentions of achieving the same goal in moving the needle to help accelerate the energy transition to sustainable energy, I don't really consider them my competitors. I consider the hydrocarbon industry my competitors. I consider energy retailing, incumbent industries that need to adopt technologies such as this to, drive a much bigger impact than trying to compete with people building similar tools. But to sort of like drill down on what that differentiating factor is, I think, I'm very aware of all the different tools that are available on the market. And some of them do site assessments using LiDAR with drones. So they will go to a property, fly a drone, get like a digital surface map with this LiDAR scan that they've done, and that can generate amazing results, except that you still have to have a drone operator there with a drone and go to each individual property. And at the scale of over 20 million UK properties, that is a bit too crazy of a bottleneck. And that is definitely the best way to get the most high resolution images. But for us, we have a private data and mapping partner who supplies data and mapping to the UK government. And we're a partner of OS Data Hubs. And so luckily in the UK, there's a lot of publicly available data, but also because of how well things have been regulated in the UK. I know there's a lot of people who are very anti-regulation, but in this one specific circumstance, regulation has helped massively because everything within the land registry, OS Data Hubs, and these mapping companies geocodes perfectly. It all aligns, all of the data is structured, and it's easy to work with. And for us, that is really, really helpful. And so it means that our proprietary computer vision models that my co-founder, Dr. Anna Chabot-Wadas, has worked building, it means that we're able to perform tasks where our output and our coverage of the UK can supersede what you can get from Google Earth Engine or from Google Maps, or it can supersede, it can be good enough in comparison to a drone assessment, which is pretty good considering the cost of getting a drone operator to a site. And so, I think that's the core differentiator with us. And I think the thing that's changed in the past few months has been quite significant. And I think that's provided quite an exciting opportunity that wasn't massively deliberate, I'll be honest. But because of the nature of how we operate as a business, being AI native and sort of deep tech or whatever kind of terminology you want to use, because the models are our own, we don't have, a license. It's not an API request from Anthropic or OpenAI. The data governance we're able to do is a lot more discreet and secure. And whilst historically that wouldn't really matter too much, when the narrative in the UK has changed with the government and, the Minister of AI and the new Sovereign AI Fund, it's all about sovereignty and the UK being able to champion its own models and UK businesses being able to utilize UK technologies, and the data used for that is encompassed within the UK ecosystem and benefits other UK businesses and the UK government as a whole. But beyond that, with obviously the unfortunate global energy crisis that's happened, energy policies have been less about a nice to have with a sort of 2030, 2040, 2050 target of when we might be net zero, to sustainability is now a matter of national security. And so when those things converge, when the government interests and private company interests align on wanting secure AI data governance that you can trust, also aligned with the objectives of what the country wants to do with making energy decentralized and secure, it's an interesting time to be a startup that is able to actually integrate within those worlds better than, say, having our data outside of our control with other, off-the-shelf companies, I guess that would say.
Yeah, fascinating. It's obviously a lot of change that's hopefully going to push you in the right direction, which is good.
So talk to us about what the company looked like in the early days.
Good question. And what did it look like? It looked a lot like me sat on my sofa with my laptop and sort of like pulling my hair out, reading research papers. I'd go on YouTube channels of I remember watching a YouTube video from a university in Switzerland talking about convolutional neural networks. They were mapping residential buildings in Switzerland for, I don't even remember what they were using it for, but I was just trying to find research where I could find it. And I do not have a background in AI. So, I was doing sort of online courses and, learning about machine learning, CV, all of these different software engineering skills. And yeah, I guess it very much was a sort of bootstrapped venture. I guess I just spent a lot of time thinking very deeply about the solution. And I think that was my earliest mistake. I think the very early stages of the company, I over-intellectualized everything and I thought very, very deeply about the solution. And I think in a way that it can be a bit intoxicating if you fall in love with the solution, when really you should be falling in love with the problem. And sometimes the solution is just, a beautifully interesting thing that is just not important enough for anyone to be interested in buying it. And that's very much how it felt at the time. And in those early stages, I partnered up with my co-founder, Thomas Husselby. We studied electrical and electronic engineering together. And through that course, we studied about solar photovoltaics and battery technologies and these sorts of things. It was a really good partnership. And yeah, in those sort of like early months, it was very much a process of just finding our feet. Maybe some delusions of grandeur encouraged us to do things that I think maybe retrospectively I would have thought no one would have ever dared been qualified enough to even think that you could even try and attempt to tackle this sort of problem. But, I think retrospectively, I'm kind of glad I had those levels of like delusions and thinking I could even try and attempt to achieve this. And yeah, I think it was, I think partly because it was sort of in its early stages bootstrapped, I think it was quite a safe environment for me to just be doing it outside of my work life and just failing privately.
Yeah.
And I think failing publicly is not always a bad thing, but it felt comfortable that, my Lord, if we had got funding a few years ago, we would have spent a lot of money building the wrong company. And I think, there were a lot of lessons learned in that process. And I think most of the lessons were less about how to run a company and how to tackle investor psychology and all these other things. Even though I did spend my time reading books like The Secrets of Sand Hill Road, I feel like the things that actually had a big impact on me and the company where it is now was actually just a self-discovery process. I think there were times where I would, we're very fortunate having a lot of support from Google. And so I was speaking to someone from the Google DeepMind team and I was asking him a lot of questions. And he was like, I feel like you're actually just looking for permission for me to just say, yes, you can do this. Because you're asking a load of questions, but you can just go and do it. We work with other companies that are extremely well funded and they just do it. They don't spend their time talking to me to ask if this is possible. You actually just go and break things, or you just try and fail, and you just fail often. And sometimes, fail often enough and you'll succeed quicker than if you were desperately trying to get it right the first time. And I feel like that was an eye-opening moment for sure. And I think that was an inflection point where I felt comfortable enough to maybe be a bit more public about the business. I think like engaging a bit more with LinkedIn, trying to be a bit more open, even though I feel personally like quite an open person. I felt privately I was hiding what I was doing for the feeling of worrying I would just embarrass myself publicly by being way too ambitious and that people would say loads of lovely things to your face and think, what on earth is he doing in the background? And yeah, I feel like the early stages of the company were more a self-discovery process, I'd say.
Yeah. Fascinating. Really interesting. Really interesting journey that you've been on there. You mentioned then, so you started it when you were previously working. What was that? How long was that journey between I've got an idea and this is kind of a bit of a side hustle, I'd like this to work, before you then going all in and saying, okay, let's drop the safe established route and really go all in on this venture?
I think it took about 2.5 years.
Wow.
It took about 2.5 years. And I think part the inflection point was the state of AI changed dramatically. We got some business consultation where we had approached a very qualified business consultant who's consulted on many startups, one of them being a startup that worked in space tech in the UK. And he gave us a huge amount of advice. And he connected us with someone who is sort of like a dev company where, you would basically hire them to do dev work on your behalf and all this sort of thing. And we weren't obviously inquiring because we were wanting to pay them to do it, but we wanted to scope out how much it would cost to build the MVP that we were looking to build. And this was about a year and a half in. And he was like, once we'd broken it all down, he was like, I would say, being honest with you, if you did it through my company, it would be £5 million. And if you did it yourselves, it would be about £2 million. And at that time, that was just the cost of doing development work. The operational overheads like cloud ops, the engineering workforce involved into going from 0 to 1 and deploying a tool of that capability was not cheap. And a lot of pre-seed money was about saying, we've got a really great idea and we've identified this problem space. We've got a sort of a light sketch of an MVP, but we need money to build an MVP. And within 6 months of that, things like coding within frontier models had made a massive impact on development. And so within only maybe 6 months of that, we were looking at a reality of not only is it not going to cost £2 million to build this MVP, but we could build this MVP without raising money. And, then came to the fact when we actually wanted to raise money, about 2 years into the company, realizing that that's exactly what every startup in our space had done. And so the ceiling has raised to everyone's got an MVP that works. You actually now need traction at pre-seed level. We know the money isn't going to go into you needing to build an MVP because you can just brute force your way through pulling 100-hour weeks and have 6 Claude code agents working in the background and push something good enough out. And so it was a bit of a game of catch up, I think, in that point. And that was definitely the moment where it was a bit of a pin drop of like, okay, this is definitely a time sensitive thing. And I think we've got to really try and go all in on this. And that was when I sort of scoped out some accelerator programs, joined Google for Startups, Microsoft for Startups. I was very fortunate to join, being one of the first startups to join the Barclays Innovation Hub in Shoreditch. So they offered me some office space there. I was extremely generous of them. And so sort of getting myself into the shallow end of the pool, starting to slowly walk towards, not jumping in fully feet first. I felt very much like, I'm still willing to work all of the hours outside of my current job so that I can help sort of, at least my personal runway is indefinite, right? And a lot of the problem with friends of mine who've joined accelerator programs is they were saying that you can join an accelerator program, they give you a stipend, and if you don't make it through the first cut, within a few weeks, you then immediately don't have a job. And at that time, there were a lot of changes going on in the engineering world. And it didn't seem like the best time to not have a job. And even though that might be extremely good motivational factors to make you rush through the process, and maybe that is a driving force to success, I feel like I wasn't quite willing to take that risk at that time. I felt really at the time, I can just have my own personal runway with my current salary and work outside of these hours, and just I'm the bottleneck to getting the shipped and getting interest and attraction from investors and from customers. And so it definitely was the pin drop moment where I was like, I need to go all in. I went all in, but I didn't quit my job, if that makes sense. Like, I very much went all in, and I was probably doing 60 hours outside my sort of normal work week. So I'd say, like, unfortunately, that was like 1.5, 2 years of working 6-7 days a week, which is like very, very unhealthy for sure. And I would definitely, I'm not the guy to ever say, I really don't believe the whole 996 culture on things, that my circumstance was desperate. If I could not do that, I absolutely wouldn't have. And when I spoke to investors, I would jokingly, tongue in cheek, be like, we're bootstrapped, but I don't actually want to be bootstrapped. And so, yeah, that's kind of how we were, in a state of flux of just building the foundations outside of like work hours and trying to gain enough traction to get interest from some serious investors. But it was really, I would say, in January 2025, kind of went on a next level of all in and just tried to throw myself at it, get some interest of people that wanted to join the team, help work on the development side of things. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. A lot of founders we speak to, that sort of requirement, or but maybe the lack of resources forces insane level of focus, innovation, resourcefulness. You can achieve, I think, a lot more at times than you perhaps think. And it sometimes feels like money is the solve for everything, but actually you can get really creative without that. And sometimes
I absolutely agree, Will. I absolutely agree. I think actually now at this stage, I feel it's more likely going to be a problem that we're overfunded. I think that's a problem that no one's ever going to self-actualize and go, we actually have too much money.
Yeah.
No one's ever coming to that conclusion. But I think that is actually genuinely a risk. And I feel like it's maybe less culturally glamorous to admit that desperation is a really strong driving force. And I feel like there certainly was a moment where I became extremely goal oriented and I sort of made a contract with myself that I'm going to be unhappy until I achieve this goal. And I'm just going to throw everything I possibly can at trying to tackle this problem. And yeah, I feel like there are moments where, you know, in that process, it is a challenge because you're kind of working sort of 2 full-time jobs, but then fundraising is also a full-time job. So the maths just doesn't work. And unfortunately, there is just, you know, the concept of balance is a bit of an illusion at that point. And so I think, you know, it very much was simplifying my life. So I was just able to work at an insane level. And in that self-discovery process, I had no idea how much work you really can do. And I still feel very hungry. I still feel like there's a lot of work I still can do. I think the problems that I faced were more just human, of going, I need to eat meals, I need to sleep, I need to actually exercise myself as well. And I think those are the problems that I didn't realize were going to become so acute in my life, where, you know, I can get so excited and encouraged by an idea that I really would sometimes just not sleep and just code for a really disturbingly long amount of time. And so I kind of, obviously there's nothing healthy about that. And I will admit that probably the last 10 hours of that 24-hour session, I was breaking everything. But still, I think, you know, it does take something like that to encourage you to ever dare do something at this sort of level of intensity, because I think it is disturbingly intense sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I didn't quite realize. I knew I was not shocked by the workload. I don't think that ever surprised me when I went sort of all in on that level. I think what really surprised me was all of the things that you would either have to or be willing to sacrifice to continue on that journey. And I think, you know, the things you're willing to sacrifice at the altar of succeeding in this domain, I think can sort of surprise you. And I think, you know, I sort of made a decision. I'm just going to, you know, focus on close family and friends, and everything else I will just align towards the vision and goal of trying to sort of build this and solve this problem. And I think that really certainly is a self-discovery process, because I think going all in means different things for people, right?
Yeah.
It very much can also mean, you know, a relationship discovery process, or becoming a father, or lots of different transitory processes in your life. But at this stage in my life, going all in was being extremely selfish and not seeing anyone for a year.
Yeah. And you talk about children there. I mean, a lot of people talk about having a business is like having a baby, and a lot of what you just described there about realization of what you can actually achieve, workload, etc., is very similar to having kids, actually. Yeah, we're looking forward to seeing like Stan 3.0 when you've got kids as well. Like when you just lock and like, oh my god, what was I doing before?
Stan 3.0 might have loads less hair. I don't know. We'll see.
Comes to us all. Anyway, yeah, Alex, over to you probably.
Okay, Stan. So moving on to sort of a bit more, maybe sort of hiring or team inflection points, and you know, was there a sort of a hire or a partnership in some, you know, some form that you brought on that really changed the trajectory of the company?
Yeah, there absolutely was. So in the winter of last year, my co-founder Thomas decided to step away, you know, for numerous reasons, but it ended up being an amicable circumstance. You know, we protected our friendship. There was nothing untowards about it, but it just didn't fit where he wanted to be at that stage. And so in that time, I sort of then went from, you know, the very early stages to being sort of founder and then co-founder, and then back to sort of being a bit of a solo founder. And so a bit of a disconcerting time, because after many years of working together, you kind of obviously get used to that dynamic. And obviously, you know, We worked very well together and we achieved so much together in that process. So it felt like a bit of an end of that journey. And so it very much was a challenge to try and discover where the next stage of the company was going to come from. And fortunately at that time, my close friend who I'd mentioned earlier, who'd working at Tractable, one of his friends who he was working with at the time, Dr. Anna Chabot-Dast, was a senior AI research scientist at Tractable. So she was sort of building the deep tech that assessed properties for insurance claims for, let's say, a big hurricane in Miami. They were building models where an insurance company could assess a massive amount of properties in a much shorter time for people that are obviously in a bit of a state of crisis where their home has been flattened. They are needing to get this claim processed. And so those solutions were helping them use satellite data, analyze these roofs and buildings and assess them for insurance claims. And so she had left Tractable and she was in a state at that time, she had started her own startup called Circolog. And my friend had just put out some feelers in his network and said, hey, a close friend of mine is sort of currently looking for someone to join his team, potentially a co-founder, sort of CTO, fill that sort of role. And quite a few people at that time reached out. It got a lot of interest. And so I kind of went on a bit of a strange, what would I say, like hiring / almost dating process where you're kind of, I'm hiring, but it feels very much more like it's like, I'm in a plane that's falling from the sky and I'm looking for a pilot. It felt a bit more like that than hiring. And I think it was quite a task to convince someone to join me on that journey. And luckily through that process, met some incredible people. But the person that really had a dramatic impact was Anna. And we had quite a few ongoing conversations. And obviously there was a lot of cross-pollination from what she had worked on at Tractable, building those models, into what we've been tackling at SOLR AI. And so she was very excited about this problem space. And, she has every opportunity to work wherever she wants. But I felt it seemed moralistically compelling that she didn't necessarily want to work in insurance anymore. And I feel like, there was something maybe more tangible and meaningful about this problem space to her. Also, joining a startup at this stage was late enough so that all of the kind of frustrating early stages have gotten out of the way, but also, early enough that joining, she would have total agency. And so I feel like, we had many months of like meetings and ongoing conversations where would maybe drill down a bit too hard on the problems. And we're actually like, well, we actually need to actually talk about how we're going to work and all these other things. And so it was a long process, but throughout that process, I kind of got to a moment where I said to her, look, I've shown you our problems that we're facing and our product pipelines and the ambitious goals and the things that we want to tackle. And, she very much said, well, I feel like the type of person you're looking for is me. And I was like, correct. And I'm glad you feel that way because
I agree.
That's exactly how I feel. And that's exactly where I was trying to lead the conversation to. And so I said to her, if the stars align, I would absolutely love you to join as a co-founder CTO. And I guess, just know that offer's there. Events transpired and the stars just did align. And we had a meeting in a cafe and it just felt very exciting and it felt very compelling. And it felt really, she's a very emotionally intelligent person. I think that is incredibly important in a co-founder. And so it didn't take her long to understand me and what my objectives are. And she felt comfortable enough that she could be very open and very candid about what her goals are and what she wants. And we had a very candid conversation and it kind of went from there. And, in the sort of like months since, we had founders agreements, we were sort of, getting very official about it. And then she went full time in the company and it's been transformative. It has been truly transformative. And, I feel like certainly through this process that the people that join the company is the company, that is the most important thing. And I feel certainly through this process that realizing, finding and sourcing the best people for this problem space is the most important thing. And the credentials of what the best person isn't just the best AI researcher who's built models at Anthropic. I think there really is, it also has to be someone that deeply cares about this problem, that cares about the actual things we're trying to achieve in terms of like an actual mission statement, but also kind of has the emotional capacity to care enough about the team, and you actually work organically in that way that I've got now with Anna. And I feel like, once we've got this, it feels so special. We want to kind of encourage that through future hires. And that's going to be a difficult challenge, but it's such a compelling moment, certainly at this stage, to have her on board. And she's doing such incredible things. It is kind of equally rewarding and disappointing to have someone solve problems that I've tried my very best to try and solve for 4 years in 4 months. And I'm like, this is obviously great, but it's also, maybe
really annoying.
Yeah.
At least take 6 months out of it. Come on.
Yeah. At least take 6 months.
Yeah. Stop making it look
at
so
least make
easy.
it seem like you've
It's hard for me to.
you've struggled.
I think, from what you said there, it sounds like, well, one, that timing couldn't have been better. So, very fortunate that happened. But
It was, yeah.
I think you've got really fortunate there as well in terms of having a co-founder that brings something completely different to the table that is obviously going to help you, move the business forward rather. So I think one thing that I've always found, having done it solo, I've done it with co-founders, but the thing that really helps me personally, having that good co-founder, it's accountability, but it's also that sort of sounding board. Because sometimes when you do it on your own, you just almost need to know that someone else is doing the same as you and finding the same struggles. No, it's like, okay, it's not me. I haven't forgotten how to do this. I can do it. I always have been able to do it. I am good at what I do. And having the other person to go, finding exactly the same thing, these are the same problems I'm having, just gives you a bit of a sanity check rather than just going round and round in circles and thinking, maybe I should just give up. So that's a really powerful part. And I guess my next question was going to be, was the moment, and looking back, you think, okay, I wish that had happened earlier. And I know you had a co-founder before, but in hindsight, if Anna would have come along 3 years ago and would have been interested, would that have worked because of your co-founder, or would you have just, we've got to get her on board, we just simply have to?
It's a good question. I think it's very hard to like psychologically and emotionally try and rationalize that. But I think, let's just say the company started with me and Anna. I think we would have worked incredibly well together, but also I think we would have done well to raise a lot of money, and we might have spent £4 million building something we built for a lot less than that. And I think we would have made a lot of hiring decisions that made a lot of sense 3-4 years ago. And these are hiring decisions that we wouldn't make now. And so, the structure of the company is research-led product development and product-led growth. And so what I mean by that is, top-down frontier of AI, carving out a new path on what is possible to influence products that the company makes, and then the products that we ship and deliver that have hopefully as analog a fit to our customers as possible. And that will just hopefully organically grow. And I feel like with that, in the current state of AI, we need good thinkers. And I think when coding work and development is mostly a solved problem, we don't need manpower. We need just the best people. It becomes more about taste, and it becomes more about how you orient your thinking to tackle a certain problem. And I feel like Anna is a perfect example of that sort of person. And those are the types of people we're looking for. And I feel like when 4 years ago, it was just, no, you just hire 15 senior software engineers and you make them work 7 days a week for their vesting period, and then they all leave.
Yes.
And so, it's always funny on LinkedIn, 4 years in, someone says, it's been an absolute pleasure being on this journey. And the first thing that comes to my mind is a 4-year vesting period. Maybe that's a bit cynical of me, but anyway, there's no vesting period with Claude Code yet. And so, we have, a lot of our coding work is architected by a lot of coding agents in Claude. And obviously, the models that we train and build are proprietary, but the bread and butter of what needs to be done on a daily basis can be done with a much leaner team. And so to kind of finalize that point, I think we would have made decisions that would have locked us into an unescapable problem where luckily now we have full agency and agility to make decisions based upon the state of current technology. And that is a powerful position to be in. We're not looking to make redundancies or down round because we overexposed ourselves by thinking headcount growth equals growth. And I feel like it's certainly an exciting time.
Mm.
And it means that, we can be actually quite abstract about what it is that we want to do. And with the customers that we bring on board, we can solutionize things that are so bespoke that would be really hard to do with a bigger team, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah, absolutely. Okay. I normally ask a question around, the sort of emotional or commercial cost of, a bad hire. I don't really like that term personally, and your co-founder certainly wasn't a bad hire, but your co-founder leaving must have had quite a big cost to you and the business, emotionally, commercially, financially, whatever it was. So talk a little bit about that, because I think it's quite rare that we speak to people that have unfortunately parted ways with a co-founder. So talk a little bit about that.
I think obviously it's very emotionally taxing, and I think it was that way for the both of us. And at the time, we had lawyers, accountants running through processes on founding agreements, all of the kind of share allocations, all of the the weeds that you get stuck into. And I feel like, I don't want to speak for them, but I felt relieved that it had happened at that stage. Because if it had happened later down the line, it was like an untenable thing to unpack that. It was hard enough trying to get to grips with all of the legal and financial and accounting compliance that you have to do when you're sort of stepping away in that regard. I think that was always just a problem that you just never wanted to come up against. There's that. It is emotionally taxing because I think it's kind of, there are things that you want to avoid that you kind of can't avoid that become really urgent. And those are not things you want to talk about with a friend. You don't want to talk about legal and financial compliance and founders agreements and all these term sheets and I don't know, like equity and all these things to a friend, and particularly at that stage when it's like you kind of just want it to feel graceful. And luckily, thanks to them, they did make it a very graceful process. And I think I'm fortunate that it could have been a lot worse. It could have been a lot more challenging. It certainly was extremely stressful, but I think, because the relationship and the friendship was preserved in that way, that I think the end goal was just to get things done properly. And so it felt more graceful than, I'm sure everyone's kind of watched The Social Network, and a lot of people kind of feel that what happens in the background at these startups when these things arise. That just isn't my experience. That just didn't happen. And I'm obviously very grateful that it didn't, but it was a learning process of going for the sake of everyone, because it's not just about protecting me and protecting the company. It's also protecting, if someone does want to make a decision about, choosing a different path, then you want that to be the smoothest thing possible, and that they don't have to spend the next few months speaking to lawyers. And so that very much was a learning process of, okay, how do we structure things from a legal and, accounting and all these other factors standpoint to protect everyone involved. And I think it was a lesson I'm very grateful that I learned at this stage.
Yeah.
Because it would have been, I think, compoundingly worse in later.
Yeah. I mean, an amicable split is probably hard enough, but a split where you've fallen out or there's big disagreements, I imagine it would just be so distracting from what you're actually trying to deliver and do as a business, right? So
yeah. And if you're trying to raise a lot of money and people are looking at a cap table and saying, okay, that's quite a few million you're wanting for that percentage, and there's someone who's on the cap table with the same percentage who's, a passive party or whatever, it becomes a very challenging thing down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. Thank you.
So just looking at things from a commercial lens then. So what part of selling into this market takes longer than you thought?
That's such a good question, because I resonate with that very deeply. Sometimes it keeps me up at night. I think selling is certainly founder-led sales. And obviously, being the CEO of a company, you should be the head of sales indefinitely. And what sales means probably will change as the company evolves. I certainly do find myself selling to many different types of stakeholders, including investors and people in government, all these sorts of things. But I think the problem as it stands for sure is that the landscape of renewable energy in the UK is heavily regulated. The energy industry in general is heavily regulated. And so it also means that, there's also a very fragmented market of installers. So there aren't really franchises. There's not like a one-player market. It is a lot of individual small electricians who've got a van, panels, batteries, and that does make the sales process hard, because in a traditional sort of B2B sense, you can sort of bring someone in and have them as sort of bring in BDRs and some customer success managers. Those people would have no one to speak to, because the person on the email or the phone line is the director of the company, and the director of the company is the solar installer. And where are they during the day? They're on a roof installing solar. And so trying to speak to them is very hard. And, there's some quick wins organically, because I certainly do have a feeling of wanting to do things as personally as possible. Solar AI will be going to Solar and Storage Live tomorrow and Thursday. That's a great way of meeting installers. What I quite like to do is go to the installer training section where they're being sort of taught a new solar technology, and sort of just try and poach some people and go, have you thought about solar tile? Have you thought about, using, all that sort of thing, and just bore them to death. But I think traditional methods, even modern methods, where like I wish we could use things like clay and we could enrich all of our sort of like data pipelines, build beautiful CRMs. It doesn't really work if these companies like sometimes have a website that was maybe made on Wix.
Yeah.
And they've got like an email, and the email's managed by their dad, and it's that sort of thing. And obviously that's great. There's nothing inherently bad about that. It just the latency to be able to do business is just really hard. And so that means that in the winters when it's a bit too cold and rainy for solar to be put up, because you can't get scaffolding in and all that sort of thing, that's a great time to be doing all of the outbound emails and things like that. But it is just hard. And I was on a meeting with someone a few weeks ago, and I said, I genuinely think I could have invented a tool where I'm like, okay, our AI is so good, we've now just got this robot that will go up on a roof and install solar panels for you for free, and you could just go to the pub. And I would struggle to sell that tool, because people are just not very contactable, and the discovery process of these installers is quite hard. And so I feel like that is definitely a problem that we faced. And so in that problem, I almost built an entire company underneath Solar AI to try and tackle that. And so at that stage, Solar AI was just the overarching company. And I trademarked a name, NOIs, to build a platform that would basically engage homeowners and property owners and facilitate connections with installers. Because I found that no matter how well we sell our tools and technology to energy retailers or solar installers, we are still relying upon them utilizing tools and contacting homeowners. And that seemed like a big problem that wasn't really being solved. I was like, if I've spent this many years in the industry and I'm struggling to get hold of installers, then surely property owners also are. And so NOIs was sort of incepted at that point to build kind of a marketplace powered by AI, where people could, almost a little bit like Rightmove, but for solar, in a way. Maybe not the best analogy, but it is just where you would type your address into NOIs and it would provide an entire proposal to that property owner. And then it will connect you to installers within your network. It will tell you about grants available in your area. You'll be able to have access to certain finance schemes and things like that. And so that was a way in which we could build this thing to try and solve some of the pain points we were having with the sales process, so that we could sell Solar AI technology under the sort of umbrella of a sort of more customer facing brand like NOIs. And that's worked quite well. And we've been able to tackle, partnerships with an incredible company called Solar Tile, and they have like a UK wide installer network that's always growing. They're doing incredible stuff. And for them, despite how great they are, you can always do better. And the directors and founders there, they're excellent. and they're hungry, they're looking to expand and just grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And there aren't necessarily the most easy ways for them to be discoverable. And so in those moments when someone is looking to get solar installed and they speak to their energy provider, they're kind of given the solutions that works or the deals that that energy provider's done. And we kind of wanted to democratize that a little bit, where we offer different technologies, options that maybe these property owners didn't know were on the table. And there's things in recent history that have become very exciting about what we'll be able to do with NOIs and the commercial side of NOIs for commercial property owners. But yeah, it's enabled us to have this test bed where we've started to try and solve the sales process for these problems within the industry. Because yeah, that question really did hit me, because we really do have that problem. So yeah.
I think, have you built that? You say you sort of almost built a sub company there. But I think from what I can see, because I was on your website earlier, everything you just talked about there, that's built now into the SOLR AI website, if I'm not mistaken.
So NOIs is its separate website and platform,
right?
But it's all powered by SOLR AI technology. So SOLR AI website is just basically a landing page for investors and like large businesses. But NOIs is a platform that installers actually use and homeowners use to find solar installers, and we kind of try and automate a lot of these administrative processes for those installers and energy retailers, if that makes sense. So it's all powered by our SOLR AI technology. There's our SOLR AI API and a lot of the processes and data points that we're using. But yeah, sort of NOIs is just this sort of like separate platform that is powered by our technology.
It's fascinating how you end up iterating and innovating and almost then a whole separate solution there through necessity. But like you say, the idea still has to be right. Hindsight's always 2020. But what could you do, or what would you do differently if you could do it all again now?
I think I'd get more sleep. Honestly,
I would say a real thing.
I would say my mum is the CEO of our family. Me and my sisters and my dad all have our own companies. And my mum is the CEO that runs the show in the background. And when I see my mum, she's always like, Stan, you need to go on holiday and you need to get more sleep and you need to get some rest. And that's not her saying that I look tired. Maybe it is. But I think it's more about, obviously she knows me very well. And I think in a rejection to this kind of 996 hustle culture, I think, the body does keep the score, and sleep is a tool to performing better. And I think if I could go back, I would tell myself to get some bloody sleep, to be honest. Because since then, since I've been more guarded about my sleep and my sleep health, I'm able to do better work.
We had a really interesting chap on the podcast, one of the first ones we recorded actually, and he was talking about this. Your frontal lobe is how you make your decisions, and call that. Well, he referred to that as like your rocket ship, and then your chin brain is in the middle, and that's probably like your fast car, and then your lizard brain at the back, and that's probably like a scooter. But if you are burnt out, you're running on low, you're not getting much sleep, you may be having a few drinks here and there because it's a good stress reliever, your frontal lobe, your rocket ship is simply not performing. It can't function. So therefore, that's how you make all of your tough decisions. You are literally unable to make a tough or difficult decision. You're relying on your lizard brain to do that, which is a bad idea. But until you sort of understand a little bit more about how it all works, you don't give priority to things like sleep. Once you do start doing it and you realize you can function much better, it makes perfect sense. But you don't know what you don't know. And I think a lot of founders fall into that trap for sure. Yeah. It's an interesting point.
It feels counterintuitive at the time, but then when you look back on it, you realise. Over to you, Alex.
Okay, so I think you've had a really interesting journey. I think it's not an unfamiliar one, but I think it's really interesting. What was there a sort of belief you had about either running your own startup or startups in general that you've now completely changed your mind on?
That's a good question. I guess 4 years ago, I certainly thought it required a lot of investment from venture capital to do anything significant, particularly in the space of AI and software engineering. And I would say I feel like the biggest change is that I now think in the next few years we'll see startups that have gotten no investment that are able to, not even necessarily just bootstrap, but the the overhead cost of like developing things now is just so low that we'll see startups emerge with solo founders who have built enterprise level solutions and disrupting a market that people previously thought was unpenetrable just with some Claude Code agents and their laptop. And I think we're also approaching an era where there could be founderless startups. There could just be entirely agentically built startups that just self-contain themselves, that don't require any funding. And I feel like the world of startups is massively changing. I think, there is still obviously a bewildering amount of money to be had on the table from venture capital. That it's quite exciting, but I think the thing that I thought or believed at the time that's dramatically changed is that you don't need money now, at least in this space, to start to build something meaningful and impactful. You get to a certain stage, if there's certain things you really want to achieve, you want to rapidly grow and reach a level of market penetration and scale, then obviously you do need a lot of capital to be able to achieve these things. But that also might change soon quite rapidly too. These things every 6 months, we seem to have some new thing that Anthropic can just do.
Yeah.
That was previously a startup that was worth 50 billion or whatever. And so I feel like that's the change. I think for me, it was partly that's because that was the landscape at the time. That really was the case. That was the reality. But I think not enough people are being told you don't necessarily have to get funding from a venture capital firm to have the authenticity of saying that you are a startup. It can be a badge of honor, but for some people that's the only litmus test to prove that you even are real or a company. And I think that can be this is not me being anti VC, obviously, but I think for some people, and for me, if I could look back, it's certainly worthwhile to try and address, is the venture route right for you? Because that's a really difficult question. And if you understand the landscape of how venture funding works, you'll realize that it's not as simple a question to answer as you might think. And I feel like, another layer to that might be beyond just, is venture capital right for you? I think you kind of have to address where you really want the company to go and what you want to do with it. And some people make the mistake of building a company for a venture capital firm. And you might actually do quite well in succeeding in doing something like that. But I think, are you really building something and selling it to a venture firm? Or are you trying to actually solve a problem and sell it to your customers? And I think the hysteria of the attention that the venture capital world gets, particularly in the sort of software space, even in the climate tech space now, I think it shifts the narrative a little bit incorrectly, and people sort of getting a bit over intoxicated in that world. And I think that's probably what I would change my mindset on a little bit, that you just maybe don't have to seek venture funding at all.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point. That lands incredibly well with me, and I'm sure will, because we chose at the start of all this to not go that route for a lot of reasons, to be honest with you. Which didn't feel it was right for us in terms of what we were trying to achieve, but that didn't suit the journey that we wanted to have either. So that hits me for sure. And then advice is maybe not the right word, but have there been any learnings in the last sort of 12, 18 months that you would want to share with a founder that was maybe 12 to 18 months behind you?
There's a lot of bad advice out there. And maybe
That's
what
why I
I'm about
avoided
to
it.
say is also bad advice. I think there's a lot of noise, and it's hard to differentiate between the signal and the noise. And I'd say the only way you can really know is to just be your own signal and just drill down, find a problem that you want to solve, desperately try and solve that problem, and try to not listen too much to the advice that's openly available. I think there's a swarm of noise and bad advice, and I think there's a lot of advice out there which is great advice for that person in that circumstance, or it could be great advice for someone that just isn't you. And I think it's hard to differentiate and actualize on what advice is applicable to you. And sometimes you learn some of these things the hard way. And I think the easy solution is to try to take a bit less advice and spend more time building and solving problems. Get advice from your customers, not from advisors or from YouTube.
Yeah. Sound advice about advice. I quite like it. Okay, Jen, over to Will for the last bit.
Perfect. So just sort of looking ahead to the future of the business, right? So what sort of capability or function do you know will become critical for you guys in the next 12 to 18 months?
Good question. I think as our model capability changes, we have intentions to scale up sort of training process. So we're planning to train our models on a very large supercomputer. That will have a dramatic impact on how our tool works and the multimodality of like where the tool can be applied. So it's not just automating assessments. In the future, we hope that we can provide a solution so that we can provide just general renewable energy intelligence to energy companies or to local councils. Things such as a local council saying, we've got this much budget, we want to deploy solar. How do we differentiate between these schools, hospitals, garages, all these different municipal buildings or whatever? We want to be able to provide access so that information becomes extremely available and you can get proposals done at low cost. So it's not just necessarily about providing exceptional tools to exceptionally well-funded big private companies, but also trying to assist on sustainable energy being deployed where it's kind of needed most. I feel like with the energy crisis, the winter of this year is going to be very, very hard for a lot of people who are already in a lot of energy debt. And so I feel, luckily, for the partnerships that we've got and for the trajectory that we're on, we might be able to go into certain partnerships where the overhead costs for us can be quite low so that we can do slightly more philanthropic things where we can tackle known problems within how policy is turned into panels on roofs for, councils and the UK government as a whole, or maybe, governments throughout other parts of Europe, so that we can move the needle on this energy transition much quicker than it's already happening. I feel like I think that's the thing that actually really does excite me. I think I've been asked quite a few times, what's your kind of exit strategy? We've been approached by sort of like A's and people looking to like acquire companies. It's made me think about what the goals are really for the company. I think I'd love to be in a place where me and my co-founder Anna have exited and we can focus our time on the developing world getting renewable energy where they don't basically even have a grid. And I think the beauty of the technology that we're currently building and the state of AI and how these things work is the cost can be so low once you've got past a certain point that it would be negligible for us to charge a ridiculous amount of money, like crazy enterprise SaaS fees, to a government or to a local council. I think that is what excites me, I think, about the next stages of what we're building.
But it's really inspiring to see your sort of passion for the solution. It's not about that kind of big money exit. It's about solving real world problems. And as you say, moving the needle on the energy transition, which is, I think we need more people like you doing that ultimately.
I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. Maybe I'm lying through my teeth and I buy a Lamborghini next year.
You could do both. You could do both.
You could do both.
You can turn up in the Lamborghini.
And just, I guess, lastly, what sort of kind of leader or profile of individual do you think you'll eventually need that you don't need yet? And I mean, that could be around you two exiting the business and then the succession plan of that business, or it could just be to facilitate that next stage of growth of the business.
That's a good question. I think the types of financing we're looking for is leaders who are willing to join the journey with us in that regard. I think that we will never turn down venture funding where they want to kind of just be a little bit passive or just have one board seat or that sort of thing. But we're kind of looking for investment where they take the lead on how we can get to the next stage of distribution. And I think that's what I would see in terms of leadership, whether that's institutional investment, where a big company that we're working with decides to invest in us with the interest of maybe that also being an acquisition, or it being a different direction where, one of our data providers decides to invest in us in a similar route. I think that's what we want. I think we have a vision of where we really want to be in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. And so with that in mind, there are people that we think about where we would kind of want them to be not just invested in our success, but literally financially invested in it too. And so we're kind of going on that journey together. And they're kind of taking the lead, solving the things that are too hard for a company of our size to solve. And that's something that's quite powerful about these sort of institutional investment, or the kind of like venture arms of big companies. And I'm not naming any names. It's a little bit dismissive. I don't want to sort of, illuminate too much, but yeah, that we have companies in mind that I think that could facilitate that level of leadership for us. Because I think there are things that, there are big companies in this industry that have, massive teams of people that have worked in this industry for 30 years. And that's something you can't solve with Claude.
Yeah.
And there are things that are tangible, that are human, about being a human interface between our world and the wider world of just the energy transition in general. And I think that's what we're looking for. We're looking for someone to take the lead on that next stage of where we're trying to get to. And I would hope that that person's also invested financially as well as kind of emotionally.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, listen, Stan, wish you all the best with it. I think we're probably out of time. So thanks very much for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you on. Great to speak to you, and wish you all the best as we continue to track your progress, and whether that is onwards into exiting and helping other things, or whether that's driving that Lamborghini, and who's what the future holds.
You're going to regret saying that now, aren't you?
It's been a true pleasure. Thank you, Will and Alex. I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Good to see you. Thanks very much.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers, and you.
Bye for now.
He's gone.